U.S. President Donald Trump has been sharpening his rhetoric against China, claiming that he has seen evidence that Beijing created a new coronavirus in a medical lab. Trump's claim, however, goes against his own intelligence agencies that say they have seen no evidence that the virus is quote-unquote man-made. The allegation comes as the New York Times reported the White House is putting pressure on U.S. intelligence agencies to provide evidence in support of Trump's claim. At the same time, Trump upped his anti-Chinese rhetoric to a new level after he alleged that Beijing is doing anything it can to make him lose the 2020 election. But what does Trump's conspiracy theory signify? It's an attempt to cover up his failure to combat the coronavirus pandemic, which he initially said was under control, but as of now has killed nearly 65,000. Before we start tonight's debate, let's go to Beijing and ask Press TV's correspondent Stephen Array about China's reaction to the U.S.'s accusations. Stephen?
Well, the Chinese knew that China was going to be the central issue of Donald Trump's election campaign for the presidential election this year. Of course, campaigning has started, and sure enough, China is the big issue with these accusations. The Chinese also are aware that blaming China, China bashing, would be the best way for Donald Trump to distract attention away from America's failure to effectively handle this epidemic. In China, we've had 12 new cases in the last 24 hours. There have been many days when there has been no new cases. The number of active cases in China is below 600 now, and it's heading towards zero. This contrasts with America, where there are still over 20,000 new cases every day. Different states are doing different things. Some states have lockdowns, others don't. So any progress made by the states having the lockdowns can be quickly undone the minute they lift those lockdowns, because people are just free to cross state lines, of course. So China is aware that to distract attention away from this huge failure of America's handling of the disease, the best thing to do is blame China. They've been pointing out that, as you say, Trump has contradicted his own officials. No expert believes this disease was genetically engineered. They know the genetics of it very well. They know the DNA, and experts all agree that it could not have been made as a weapon. The CIA itself, as you say, has said there's no evidence to show that it was accidentally leaked from a laboratory. They're talking about Trump is talking about the Institute of Virology in Wuhan, but his experts are saying that there's no evidence to say that it did come from there. In spite of him putting all that pressure on them, they're under orders to find China was responsible, which they are not saying. All experts in China, in the USA, agree the overwhelming probability is that this virus jumped from an animal to humans in a non-laboratory setting. So with all of this information, China is actually being quite subdued when it comes to responding to the blame that America is now apportioning. The Foreign Ministry spokesman on Tuesday said, "We advise American politicians to reflect on their own problems and try their best to control the epidemic as soon as possible, instead of continuing to play tricks to deflect blame." If there is something that China is guilty of, it's playing the same game as America. Social media in China is awash with stories that this was bioengineered by America. It's an American creation, this virus. Of course, nothing really goes on social media without the government allowing it to. So we have to say that the Chinese government is actually playing an active role in pushing these false narratives about America. So if China is guilty of something, it's doing the same thing as America and spreading false narratives. But in some, China is being remarkably restrained in its reaction to Donald Trump's accusations against China, which otherwise might have a serious effect on China-US relations.
All right, thanks a lot. Stephen Press TV's Stephen Rebay joining us from Beijing. We're now bringing in investigative journalist Tony Gosling, who's with us from Bristol. Welcome to the program, Mr. Gosling. Donald Trump has renewed his attacks on China, saying his administration was conducting serious investigations into Beijing's handling of the coronavirus outbreak and suggesting he would seek damages for the U.S. Is Trump trying to deflect some of the criticism that he's been facing recently?
Well, of course he is. Trump always tries to do this because he's a terrible manager and he hasn't really thought things through about how, as many people in the West haven't, about how we're going to get out of this lockdown situation. The Swedes, for example, though, have decided to allow many of their far less vulnerable younger people get infected, which means that when it comes to lifting the lockdowns, and in Sweden it's a very light lockdown, it means that the population will be resistant to passing on for a second wave, whereas in the United States and Britain, we have locked ourselves now into this whole situation where we're trying to stop everybody getting the virus, whether they're likely to die from it or not, and therefore, when that lockdown is released, there's much more likely to be a second wave, and they'll have to reintroduce it. So I don't think Trump or Boris Johnson have really thought through this. I think the Swedes have done a much better job, but I must take issue with your correspondent. I think the jury is still out about whether this is a natural virus and a man-made virus, because I think we will be able to probably make a much better judgment on that several months or even possibly a year down the line. There are elements to this disease which do not seem to occur in nature. One of them is the very long period it takes to actually develop in the body, and another is the inability of normal techniques to actually treat people with the disease. It's clogging up a lot of ICU units, and so there is some evidence, just literally circumstantial evidence, about the way the disease is behaving that does suggest it could be designed to actually, tie down a country, because that's what good weapons do. I use the word good very loosely, is they don't necessarily kill everybody. What they do is they tie up the country, the government and the system with having to treat lots and lots and lots of very sick people. And so there is, this is obviously what flu and influenza viruses and even very strong common cold viruses do anyway. So I think the jury's still out on that. As for Donald Trump and his actions, I think it's really rich coming from him, because there is evidence that the United States government itself was funding, and there's an article in Nature magazine, funding bat virus transition research. The University of Wisconsin-Madison was one of the worst for this. And what they were doing was they were experimenting to try and see if they could make viruses go from a bat to different animals, even to humans, certainly to mice. They managed to get viruses that would go from a bat to a mouse. And the US government only in 2015 shut that research down, saying, well, there's no point in doing this. It's actually extremely dangerous. And then there is the Pentagon's grant, which has literally just come out in the last few days. Breitbart magazine has released it, to the virology lab in Wuhan via a company in the United States called Eco Health Alliance, which was funded by the Pentagon, would you believe, to fund the Wuhan lab to do this research on what they call weapons of mass destruction. So I think the United States needs to take a very cold, hard look at itself before it starts blaming China for creating this, because a lot of money has been going, US Pentagon money and government research money has been going into literally playing with viruses to see what they can do with them.
Let's bring in Mr. Mike Billington from Executive Intelligence Review's Asia Desk, who's with us now from Leesburg, Virginia. Mr. Billington, welcome to the program. Earlier in the week at a briefing, Donald Trump launched another attack on China, saying that there were a lot of ways to hold them accountable for the pandemic. What is he trying to achieve by making these statements?
Well, let me say first that the other gentleman's story about the U.S. hiring the Wuhan virology lab is true, but it's not for weapons of mass destruction. It was done because there was actual collaboration between people doing research into viruses, both in the U.S. and in China. There's been close collaboration between U.S. scientists and that lab. In fact, the U.S. helped set it up. along with the French and others. And it's quite safe. All the stories about them, leaking, let alone the incredible lies from Navarro about how they purposely created the virus, are not only wild conspiracy theories, but they're extremely, extremely dangerous. The fact that Pompeo and Navarro have been following a British lead, actually, most of these lies came out of people like Niall Ferguson in England, who passed out the story that the Chinese were sending airplanes internationally after they shut down the domestic flights. Total lie, which was proven to be a lie by a professor at Columbia. And the Henry Jackson Society in London, which is virtually mobilizing for war against China. And this stuff is fed into the US. And as far as Trump goes, what's absolutely most important, you're right that he's made some extremely dangerous statements the last few days. Why? As you know, Trump was elected, and as soon as he was elected, he was basing his campaign and got massive support because he said we should be friends with Russia, and then became a very good friend of Xi Jinping's. And all of this hysterical anti-China stuff that you see all over the US and Europe, especially in England, is exactly the same as the Russia hysteria created by MI6 through Christopher Steele and Dearlove and so forth, for the purpose of undermining Trump from doing what he in fact intends to do, which is to establish good relations between Russia and China. Now, he gave in a little bit on this Russia stuff too. You remember, he expelled a bunch of Russian diplomats. He was sucked into a foolish but minor attack on Syria because of claims about chemical weapons. But he does that largely to appease the lunatics who he has around him, primarily because he has had nobody else to defend him. The entire media, the entire Democratic Party, and most of the Republican Party have been at war with Trump from the time he got elected, precisely to stop his breaking up the British imperial division of the world into the East and the West. Now, I would very strongly argue that while what Trump is saying right now about China, almost saying that they are responsible, you have to take that in the context of this massive attack against Trump. And we are in a pre-war situation with China right now because of this mania peddled by the neocons, by the British assets and so forth, that basically is pre-war. The Henry Jackson Society and Tobias Elwood, the defense minister in England, the other day actually said we should prepare for war against China the way we did in the 1930s against the Nazis. This has got to be stopped, but it can only be stopped if you distinguish between Trump and his intentions and the massive campaign to both throw him out of office and to break his commitment to working closely with Putin and with Xi Jinping. And keep in mind that he's been on the phone 5 times now with Putin in the last week.
All right.
We can break him. Yeah, go ahead.
Mr. Gossing, you were shaking your head there. Would you like to add anything to that?
Well, it's about Tobias Elwood. Was he born in the United States, for example? And we haven't seen Boris Johnson pointing the finger at China and saying this is a Chinese virus, have we? I think we're seeing a little bit of projection here to the UK as being the origin of all this. Yes, there may be some think tanks here, I'm sure there are, that are blaming China for it. But actually, the most vocal is Donald Trump himself. And if he doesn't believe that this is a virus that's been engineered by the Chinese, he shouldn't say so. And I think it's a bit rich to blame the British for somehow controlling what's coming out of the United States. There's been an absolutely appalling media, I think, and I've spoken to several doctors, and we've even seen them on the British television, really calling out the mass media and saying that there's been a tremendous amount of disinformation over this virus. For example, over in Sweden, we've seen them calling for saying, but basically there's been not a single case of reinfection of Covid-19 in Sweden. So this does raise the case. This is simply fake news that's been being peddled, that people can get reinfected. Well, they may test negative and they may then test positive, but that doesn't mean to say they've been reinfected. all it means is that potentially that the virus has somehow, become stronger within them. Anyway, the Swedish are saying that this is nonsense. Once you've had this disease, you have a very strong level of protection. Obviously, you may catch a SARS virus or a flu or something afterwards, but the idea that you can get reinfected is simply being done to scare people, and the mass media have been peddling that all over the Western world.
Mr. Billington, let's turn our attention to the U.S.-China trade bickering. At this point, the U.S. president said on Thursday his hard-fought trade deal with China was now of secondary importance to the coronavirus pandemic, and he threatened new tariffs on Beijing as his administration has crafted retaliatory measures over the outbreak. Is the coronavirus pandemic now going to claim the life of this trade deal as well?
Oh, it's possible because of this hysteria. Let me just mention to your other associate there, Boris Johnson has not said anything like that, and that's important that he and Cummings and others have been much more serious. But when you're talking about the British Empire, you're talking about British intelligence, the City of London, the people who are, in fact, as you say, the think tanks like the Henry Jackson Society, which together with the Atlantic Council in Washington, this is the old imperial, neoconservative, warmongering imperial thinkers. These are the people you have to stop. And again, I reiterate, we are in a pre-war situation because of this insanity. We broke through the Russiagate fraud. The LaRouche organization was at the center of exposing the fact that the Obama intelligence team was working directly with MI6, Dearlove, Christopher Steele, and others in an effort to break Trump from his commitment to bringing the U.S., Russia, and China together. And we broke that. And we can break this China thing, too. But it has to be done by understanding the way this political intelligence operation is being worked. Now, the Schiller Institute, my institute, held a conference last weekend which brought together Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the head of our organization, key Americans, American scientists, American farmers, American political leaders, with China's top delegate in New York, Wang Ping, the consul general in New York, and with Mr. Polyansky, the #2 Russian person at the United Nations mission. So we're dealing here with proof in that conference, and I encourage your audience to go to schillerinstitute.com and watch that conference to see how we're demonstrating that we can and we must bring the United States, Russia, and China together to deal with this pandemic, especially deal with the fact that Africa is about to be committed to a Holocaust because of their miserable health condition brought about by the last 50 years of neo-imperial policies from the IMF, the World Bank, and so forth that have kept Africa in a state of absolute backwardness. And it's going to be a true Holocaust there if this thing takes off, as it will if we don't mobilize massive health facilities across Africa immediately, and that Russia and China and the United States, Putin, Xi Jinping, and Trump have to act on that, and they have to act on the fact that we're facing a global financial breakdown with the Federal Reserve here printing somewhere in the range of $5 or $6 trillion to bail out banks, not just the economy, the banks, which is creating a hyperinflationary danger of extreme proportion, which could only be dealt with when you have the U.S., Russia, and China working together to deal with these global, this global crisis of multiple crises.
Tony Gosling, when we look at the back and forth between the U.S. and China, one has to think that the looming presidential election that has amplified this rivalry. Much of the recent attacks on China might be more about domestic politics and Trump's re-election campaign than anything else.
Well, that's true. And also the idea, of course, is to make massive foreign policy decisions, to make them the center of the agenda in order to distract from failures at home. It's also well worth pointing out that the IMF and the international oligarchy effectively have been waiting in the wings here with their new cryptocurrency that they want to bring in to replace the old special drawing rights from the IMF. So there is the predator capitalist class are sitting here rubbing their hands now, waiting for the global economies to have problems, and then they're going to come in with their brand new system that they designed, which they will use then to even further control the international financial markets. So there are a lot of people out there who are seeing this as a great opportunity to make a lot of money and actually to get even more control. Which one example is the World Health Organization. The Bill Gates Foundation is now the #1 funder, and as after the 2008 financial crisis, governments had less money to spend on these NGOs, and internationally important though it is, now effectively the World Health Organization has been privatized. It hasn't got a doctor in charge, it's got an Ethiopian failed politician in charge who many say is basically buyable. So that's the kind of situation we're in now, where even organizations like the World Health Organization can't necessarily be trusted. It's a form of regulatory capture by the vaccine industry, which I think is going to come down the line and say basically a vaccine or a vaccine passport, Bill Gates and his ID 2020, everybody is going to have this in the Western world anyway, therefore they're allowed to travel. So we're seeing what's been going on in China, the mass surveillance society, the coronavirus being used as an excuse to bring that to the West. And I think all eyes need to be on Sweden to see how they manage to cope with their very much more open policy and the idea of actually encouraging young people to catch the virus, recover, and then protect the rest of their society.
Mike Billington, I'd like to get your final thoughts on the topic. We have about 30 seconds for you.
Well, your associate there showed his colors. I mean, you're basically peddling the same conspiracies that are being peddled by people like Pompeo and Navarro and the Atlantic Council and the Henry Jackson Society, blaming China, claiming all these conspiracies. Look, we have to get China's Belt and Road idea, which is an American system idea, by the way. The whole Belt and Road idea came from Lyndon and Helga LaRouche, working with the Chinese in the 1990s. And right up through Xi Jinping adopting this, to bring development to the third world, to bring infrastructure, to bring health. They're now running the Health Silk Road. We must break this war against Trump and China and bring these people together to make a development future, not one based on blaming China and starting a confrontation with China at the time that they have brought 800 million people out of poverty and are taking that development process into Africa and South America, the places that the Anglo-American financial cartels have destroyed by not allowing any kind of real development. This is a turning point in history. Gotcha.
Yeah, we're fresh out of time. Allow me to thank my guests, investigative journalist Tony Gosling joining us from Bristol, also from the Executive Intelligence Review's Asia Desk, Mike Billington joining us from Leesburg, Virginia, and also a special thanks to your viewers for staying with us on tonight's debate. Good night, everybody.